Dun dun! Hi, my name is John Green, and welcome to Crash Course US History. And today we're gonna talk about sex. No, not that sex, you pervert. The sex that gives you birth, handles monthly bloody pains, and is scientifically proven to be better at multitasking. Impossible, right? Woman. Stan, roll the libertage! So today, women enjoy the same rights as men. They receive the same opportunities, the same jobs, the same treatment. Well, not really. But things were a lot more different back then.
Mr. Green, Mr. Green! I'm pretty sure women back then were treated like queens and sat in their royal thrones and were served by millions of maids and butlers.
Me from the past. Girly me before puberty. If you actually believe that, you're in for a wild ride. So women were pretty rare in the first settlement in Jamestown because most of the people who came were silversmiths and goldsmiths looking for, well, gold and profit. And back then, women did not have jobs like that, so none of the workers that came were women. In fact, they were so rare that they were quickly married off, and some men remained inevitably unmarried. And in Jamestown, women actually had a little more power than their sisters back in England or New England because of the poor sanitary conditions in Jamestown, you know, like mosquitoes and stuff. Their husbands often died early of, you guessed it, disease. Finally, disease doing mankind some good for once. Now, the settlement in New England was a lot different. The people, or should I say Puritans, that came and formed the Massachusetts Bay Colony were like super religious. As in, they took the Bible word for word, literally, for every sentence. So the idea of women's rights and suffrage, or even just asserting their opinions, was like Star Wars to them. And they were so harsh and strict about the rules that they exiled Roger Williams because he had a different view on religion. He later went and formed a charter colony, Rhode Island. On the other hand, there was Anne Hutchinson, who also had a different religious view, but she was treated even more harshly because she was a woman. She was exiled from the Bible Commonwealth and was eventually killed by Native Americans, where she was heading towards New York. And although women were unable to speak and contribute actively in society, they were not completely powerless. For example, they were actually pretty important in average household. See, the colonies wanted good citizens, and that's what's more effective than receiving the very education from their mothers. That's the idea of Republican motherhood. And it gave women the responsibility to teach their children to become good citizens, giving up selfishness for the common good. Some women did speak and give their opinions about things. No, they did not all get burned as witches, and they did not get killed like Anne Hutchinson. Yes, women were unable to voice their opinions in public, but they were able to do so at home. John Adams, an influential figure, was strongly affected by his wife Abigail Adams' guidance and opinions. One of which was to defend the British soldiers in court for the Boston Massacre. And although expansion and politics were mostly done by men, there was one woman worth noting, and that was Sacagawea. When Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon in order to increase land so that small farmers can purchase the land and grow crops to increase that Jeffersonian economy, Lewis and Clark were sent to explore the area and map it. Well, they eventually got lost because they went too far and would have starved to death if it were not for the guidance of Sacagawea. Now, women did not choose to say this way though, so the idea of women's rights and suffrage will eventually come up. Oh, it's time for the mystery document! The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, I don't get shocked. And if I do, bye-bye. Anyways, alright, let's see what we have here. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to such a course. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. I'm gonna stop right there, Stan. The Declaration of Sentiments written at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Yes, too easy, Stan. Let this be my declaration of happy sentiments. So the first official suffrage movement for women's rights happened in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention. There, women's rights activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Sarah Grimke argued that women were equal to men. Most of these amazing ladies, including Elizabeth Blackwell, were involved in the formation of the National Woman Suffrage Association in 1869, which led to the creation of the National American Woman Suffrage Association in 1890 that advocated the spread of women's influence while amalgamating it with their traditional roles. However, the idea of women's suffrage was not supported by all. There was this idea called the Code of Domesticity that said that home was women's territory and they should, by definition, remain and confine in there. So this idea of women receiving suffrage was received with heavy ambivalence. They attracted few African Americans, immigrant, and working class women. Yet they could increasingly vote more in local elections. Let's go to the thought bubble. The Wyoming Territory provided unrestricted suffrage to women in 1869, and when it achieved statehood 21 years later, it still kept women's suffrage. Other states followed suit. The Utah Territory had women disenfranchised by Congress, but when it achieved statehood, it received suffrage through popular vote. Colorado, Idaho, Washington, California, and other states followed suit, and by 1919, 39 states had extended suffrage to women, whilst 15 of them provided them with full suffrage. Yet some women actually protested against suffrage, claiming that it disrupts the natural order, associating suffrage with increased divorce, neglect of children, loose morality, and promiscuity. Now, women in World War I took jobs as nurses in the battlefront while taking up jobs in factories which men would traditionally enroll in the home front. And although this wasn't the first time women became nurses in the battlefront, for example, Clara Barton in the Civil War, women received more recognition in their suffrage movement and eventually had the 19th Amendment, the amendment to provide suffrage for women, sanctified in 1920. However, African American women were generally excluded from the suffrage movement. Women in the progressivism era were also involved in the temperance movement, mostly because they wanted to prevent the nasty effects of drunken Homo sapiens beating them up, forcing them to cry out, "Stop it, Otto-san!" But that doesn't mean they didn't respond with violence, like Carrie Nation stormed through saloons and bashed the bars up. Eventually, the 18th Amendment got passed that issued prohibition in 1919. Apart from prohibition, women also advocated prison reform, the elimination of the wage system, and the end to prostitution. Prostitution was deemed as the social evil in society. Many women fought against prostitution through state and federal laws, fighting to get age of consent raised. Eventually, the Mann Act was passed in 1910 that made it a felony for interstate and foreign commerce transport of prostitutes, thus preventing human trafficking as well as cooling off them sugar daddies. The settlement house movement was also taking place. Initiated by Jane Addams, the founder of the Hull House, the movement involved an 8-hour workday for women, an end to child labor, and better working conditions for women. This was especially important as seen in the disastrous Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1911 that prompted the formation of the Women's Bureau which would provide protection of women's interests in the workforce. Furthermore, the case of Mueller versus Oregon supported the idea of protecting women and children in the workplace. Yet some oppose this because it indirectly shows the female's weakness and thus her inferiority. Florence Kelly supported these ideas in her Hull House maps and papers. It's also important to note that African Americans were not included in settlement houses, showing that even though slavery was over, discrimination was not. Yet civil rights for African Americans were advocated by some women, such as Ida B. Wells Barnett, who helped found the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Birth control seemed to be promoting as well. For example, Margaret Sanger, a nurse in New York City, was jailed for distributing contraception devices. And even though birth control didn't go viral, it was still important because it marked the transition of women endorsing unorthodox ideas. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Which is shown by women's involvement in World War II. During the war, some 350,000 women served in the U.S. Armed Forces, both at home and abroad in the battlefront. Meanwhile, widespread male enlistment left gaping holes in the industrial labor force. Between 1940 and 1945, the female percentage of the U.S. workforce increased from 27% to 37%, and by 1945, nearly 1 out of every 4 married women, which is 25%, worked outside the home. Who run the world to? World War II? Girls. When the servicemen came back, however, women returned to the home and were not expected to seek careers. But after nearly 2 decades of accepting the status quo, American author and activist Betty Friedman's A Feminine Mistake Friedman challenged this prevailing notion and caused many women to re-examine their lives. She then asked the question, if women could successfully hold jobs, why shouldn't they? Assessing the happiness, many women opted to pursue work outside the home. The modern women's movement, people, had begun. Okay, anyways. Soon women were organizing to promote social and political reforms to do away with discrimination in the workplace and eliminate barriers to entry in education and politics. Frieden herself helped found the National Organization for Women. Now, get it, okay. In 1966, along with fellow feminist Gloria Steinem. Gloria Steinem, an acclaimed trailblazer for women's rights, worked as a journalist and activist during the civil rights movement. After working for New York Magazine, Steinem co-founded Miss Magazine, a publication dedicated to women's rights concerns. After she and Frieden created Now, they worked to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, that will grant the full equality of the sexes. But before this amendment could be blown up by Gloria Steinemite, Phyllis Schlafly and the Stop the Amendment stopped the amendment from passing, staying true to their name. So the women's liberation movement was the collective struggle for equality, most active during the late 1960s to the 1970s, that sought to free women from oppression and male supremacy. And the women's liberation movement consisted of women's liberation groups, advocacy, protests, consciousness raising, feminist theory, and a variety of diverse individual and group actions on behalf of women and freedom. It refers to second-wave feminism, which targeted the fault in our unequal rights. Fault in our stars, okay, yeah. And even though it seemed that women received all their rights in the 60s and 70s, feminists today are still fighting for their rights. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.